Welcome to the Ground Rooster Ranch YouTube channel. I'm Jay, and I'm a retired police officer. If you've clicked on this link, you're likely from Nova Scotia, Canada, and you're wondering about how to resolve a property dispute that you're having over some issue. We're going to get into that. Stick around, and hopefully I can help you stop, if not prevent, an escalating problem before it gets going. Guys, if you're a resident of Nova Scotia, this may be very important for you. The way our property access rules are here are a little bit different than most other places. We're going to get into that. But before I do, I want to talk about legal advice. This is not legal advice. Your situation is specific to you. I'm just going to talk about my experience as a police officer here in the province of Nova Scotia as it relates to me. If anything comes from this conversation, and if it relates to you, hopefully it's helpful to you. I can talk about the experience of being a police officer, but I can't help you specifically with your situation. I recommend you seek legal advice or your local police to clarify. But we're going to go over some specific things that we're going to help you, give you guidance on what questions to ask and what questions will help you resolve your issues. Simple as that. If you need legal advice, consult a lawyer. That's the best way to go. Say you have a property dispute, a quarrel with your neighbor over a boundary line, or you have an issue with someone accessing your property. You have a bunch of different resources you can call. You have the police, you have conservation, you have fisheries. It depends on who you're talking to. But in general, if your property joins up to anyone else's boundaries, including under the Fisheries Acts and woodlands and farms and anywhere where there's a boundary at all that defines different types of property, this is going to be important for you. Here in Nova Scotia, we are bound by something called the Protection of Property Act. The Protection of Property Act is in existence for Nova Scotia only. Other provinces have their own acts, and their definitions don't exactly apply to residents of Nova Scotia or landowners in Nova Scotia. In order to talk about the act that governs us, we have to talk a little bit about Nova Scotia's history. So Nova Scotia is Latin for New Scotland. And under Scottish law, they have something called access rights and the Scottish Outdoor Access Code. And you can look this up. You can independently verify. You can search it up on the web. And Scotland does not have territorial boundaries in the same way that we do. They're a little bit different, but it applies to us in the same way. All of their land, because they don't have much in the way of woodlands like we do, all of their land is open to all public as long as you're not on a motor vehicle. That's where this comes from. Nova Scotia being the new Scotland, there's a lot of Gaelic and Scottish tradition here. That is where the act originated from. So the continuance of that heritage all through time has governed us through the Protection of Property Act here in Nova Scotia, which sets out these rules. One thing to remember is that 70% of Nova Scotia, last time I checked, was privately owned. So if you're trying to manage your wildlife species or you're trying to manage wildlife habitat, which is deemed to be all places in Nova Scotia, whether it's paved or not, you need to have an all-encompassing law that allows everyone to access all places. Now, municipalities can create their own bylaws that say that you can or cannot do these things. There's also other laws that govern access to things like firearms and boat launches and different things. So under different statutes, you can have different rules, including bylaws, federal, provincial, or otherwise. That doesn't mean that this is going to be a simple fix. And at what point in time is your issue an issue for the police? Let's talk about that a little bit. So based on my experience, police don't get involved in property-related issues. Now, disputes over property are dealt with by the Supreme Court in any jurisdiction, by any province. That's the same all across Canada. if you're arguing over territorial boundaries, you have to go to court over it. There's many steps to deal with that. That's not what this is about. This is about people accessing private land or your land, or you being a general public person who doesn't have their own land trying to access features on land that are given you permission to do. I hope that makes sense. We're gonna simplify that a little bit more. So typically disputes when police get involved are fostered by two things. There's an actual legitimate reason for the dispute to occur, meaning that there is a argument over who owns what or who is allowed to access what. That is typically the problem. And then you have the behavioral issues between people who are fostering a reaction, meaning that there could be a reaction that would be violent or aggressive or confrontational. That is the fearful issue that really is what brings people in to investigate and enforce laws on this. There is no reason for the police to be involved for any contravention under the over property because it's a court issue. You have a separate process to deal with anything to deal with property. Rightfully so. The police shouldn't be able to say whose is what for who's deciding or who's saying what should be whose. They shouldn't be the deciding factor. They should simply do as they always have done and bring the facts forward for a judge to decide. In this case, the process doesn't allow for police to intervene over property disputes, especially over civil nature. We weren't able to put forward information that would help anyone because we don't have any verified information firsthand to say whose it should be or shouldn't be. That's usually up to surveyors and things like that. But when it comes to people accessing your land, you have a totally different issue. For example, I've had folks move here from the Midwest or Ontario, and the laws there are significantly different. And they're able to say their land's private and no one can hunt on it. Here in Nova Scotia, it's not that way, especially if it's forested or woodland or barren in some way. Now, if we're going to talk a little bit more about what those qualities are, we're actually just going to go through the act itself and define those things. And I'm going to show you by orating what is happening, what it actually means. Can someone access your land against your will? Let's talk about that next. Okay, can someone access your land? Let's dig into this. This is the Protection of Property Act, Chapter 363 of the Revised Statutes in 1989, and it's been amended as early as 2001. Now, this is an electronic copy because that's what I have access to right now, and this act is often cited as a Protection of Property Act. Now, this is specific to Nova Scotia. You see the Nova Scotia crest here. Now, we're going to just zip right down to Section 15. And I'm going to highlight here. This section deals a lot with trespassing. And the highlighted section that you're looking at right now is no prosecution for recreational activity. That doesn't mean you couldn't be charged by a police officer. This is above them. This is no prosecution. This is when you get to the lawyer's level and the public prosecutor has to review the case and they have to look at this section and whether or not all the clauses of this section are met. So under Section 15, subsection 1, which is right here, I'm going to say it's rated out to you. In this section, forested land means wooded area, forest stand, tract covered by underbrush, barren ground, marsh, or bog, but does not include an area which is apparently a tree plantation area or a Christmas tree management area, a special forestry study area, which there will be signage for, the immediate area where any activity is apparently being carried out on woodlands. What is that? Being carried out on woodlands for the purpose of harvesting a forested product, a commercial berry growing area. Now, subsection 2 of Section 15, no prosecution for recreational activity, is the most important for you as a property owner and user. And you need to understand this before you do anything or enact on anyone. No person may be prosecuted for contravening any notice given pursuant to this act, prohibiting entry or prohibiting activity on forested land if that person is hunting as defined in the Wildlife Act, fishing, picnicking, camping, hiking, skiing, or engaged in another recreational activity, or engaged in the study of flora or fauna. Boy, that is a huge section to digest. And as a police officer, it is really important that we understand this and we break it down into sections. So no person may be prosecuted for, let's pretend there's a semicolon there, contravening in any notice given pursuant to this act, prohibiting entry, or prohibiting activity on forested land. Meaning, if there's posted signs saying, do not enter, no trespassing, you're not required to follow them on forested land as it was described in the section above this. If that person is hunting as defined in the Wildlife Act. Under the Wildlife Act, if a person is hunting, it means that they've been issued a permit to harvest one of the Crown's animals on the land. Now that's important. That permit allows them to enter the woods to hunt. Now that doesn't allow them to enter the woods with a ATV or vehicle and hunt from that vehicle on your land of the woods. It is hunting in its truest form, presumably on foot without making any disturbances or anything of the nature, by pursuing game in a natural way consistent with hunting. Fishing. If the person has a fishing license, they're allowed to cross your forested land. They're not fishing on land, but they have to fish from it. They're allowed to do that. They're allowed to picnic on your forested land. They're allowed to camp. That's right, people can stay and sleep in your woods without being charged under the Protection of Property Act. People are allowed to hike. They're allowed to ski, or, this is a big one, engage in another recreational activity. That's all encompassing. What is a recreational activity? I will leave that to a judge to decide, but there is a lot of recreational activities that happen in the woods. Or if you're engaged in the study of flora or fauna, which is meaning if you're studying plants, which are all very valid reasons. Now, this is what's so mind-blowing to most people who come here. All of those individual things define a lot of things, if not everything, any person in the public can do in the woods in Nova Scotia. What it doesn't say is that they can cut down trees or modify the land. It doesn't deal with fires. It doesn't deal with any damage to the land from ruts, which there shouldn't be vehicles there anyway. It doesn't deal with littering. There's all different sections for that. So if someone was to go in and cut down your trees, they would have committed a mischief under the Section 430 of the Criminal Code of Canada, and that can be investigated as a crime separate to just being there. But you're likely most offended by the fact they were there in the first place, let alone the fact that they may have cut down a branch off your tree or cut a tree down or done something to actually physically damage. And the damage has to be real and not beyond the scope of what mischief would allow. So here you are, you're a property owner or you're one of these recreational people trying to access land in Nova Scotia, and the truth is that you've come across a section of law that provides you definitive permission to do this activity. That is rare. That is extraordinarily rare, and let me explain why. You have a law that grants you permission to do things. So if you look in the wildlife handbook that's given to hunters every year, you will see them suggest that you can access things, but you will see that the handbook doesn't imply the permission, because they're presuming that you have the ability to go look at the laws as they are written. And they would suggest that it's best that you ask permission. Now, hunting is a very popular topic here because we have such a small mass of land with such a small amount of crown property available to public hunting. It's very easy to get overwhelmed, and you can really bottle it up in just a few sections in Nova Scotia where there's truly any public land to hunt, whether you're and some of it's not even allowed to be hunted in because of regulations. So this really opens up the doors to anyone with a forested section of land. Now, hunting is its own animal on its own, but even in the fishing handbook, it doesn't say that you have permission to cross wooded lands. It says that you should ask permission to cross wooded lands, which is a bit of a yes, that's an appropriate and cordial thing to do, and it is the best courtesy, but sometimes it's not always easy because you're in the middle of nowhere and there's no one around to ask. If that was a fact, if that was something that you actually had to do, the province would have to give you access as the general public to all of the registry for land so that you would know who to ask if you were trying to ask those permissions. And I hope that makes sense. How am I supposed to ask permission for a parcel of land that I don't know where the section starts or begins, and I don't know who owns it? It could be someone who doesn't even live here. So in general, this is a really important piece of law that allows you to participate in recreational activities or allows you to define the activities that are being conducted out on your wooded land. Now, the definition of forested land, wooded area, stand, underbrush, barren ground, marsh or bog, that's probably something best to contact your natural resources over, whether or not your area is defined as those things. What you're going to find is that most police officers don't have definitions of these particular things. So I want you to do a little bit of research on your own for your particular situation to see if you are covered or if you're not covered by this prosecution clause, which is an absolute unicorn when it comes to laws, especially here. So when you look back at New Scotland and Scottish law being extraordinarily similar to this, anyone can go camp on anyone else's land in Scotland, and they're used to it. This typically only becomes a problem between people, how they behave. And let's get into that a little bit more. Behavior. That is the most common reason why the police get involved in your particular property disputes. Now, trespassing, obviously, as you've just seen, has a very small window in which it really generally applies to the general public. Your lawn, for instance, golf courses, anywhere, fields for agricultural purposes. Trespassing does apply. Those are places that are expected to be private. They're quite often within distances that are prohibited for certain things like firearms and different avenues of activities that are provided by the government and permitted. However, if you're having an issue where someone has crossed your woodland, which I have personally dealt with several times in several different places for many, many people, I've had to go through and explain this law that prevented me as a police officer from doing anything to stop that. Typically what we get down to is the fact that the behavior between people is what people get charged for. And quite often, people don't know that if you interfere with someone hunting legally on your woodland, you could be charged. There is a law that says under the Wildlife Act that you could be charged for interfering with a hunt. And I believe it's also interfering with a person's fishing. Those are things that come as a very great surprise because people doing everything as they are within the boundaries of law as we see fit here and here, we can't punish them for doing that. That's the way the law is. Now, if you're a landowner like I am, and you have it in your head here in Nova Scotia that you're disturbed that people can walk through your woods, well, you should probably get over that right away, because we are a very small province. It's a very unique opportunity to live here, and it's one of those places where we have all of the access to all recreational activities that exist everywhere in Canada, but we're such a small place with so much abundance that we almost have to leave it open. If you also own a motor vehicle and you're upset that you've hit 3 deer with your motor vehicle, it would be fortunate for you to have someone there to harvest those animals so that they're no longer overabundant to cause a traffic hazard, which is directly the management plan that's set out every year by Natural Resources when they go and they walk through the woods counting deer scat to determine how big herd populations are based on the weather, disease, and all these different things. If you have a fisherman crossing your property to use it, they could be a camper. That fisherman might be sleeping in your woods and getting up the next morning and fishing from your shore and fishing on the banks of that river or lake. There's nothing you could do about it. There just isn't. Any recreational activity, standing is a recreational activity, observing nature, bird watching, it all counts. And this is the most important thing that you need to remember. That as a landowner, you could be the one that ends up being charged if you get emotionally involved and say things that are criminal in nature to someone who is acting in the confines of law. Right now, that's the way it is in Nova Scotia. It's been that way since 1989, and it's been touched up a few times as late as 2001, as we've seen on the website. There may be more up-to-date versions coming at the time in which this video was put out. That is the most recent version of this law. It's very important for you to know that as someone who's partaking in recreational activity, you have equal opportunities, and as a landowner, that it's up to you to make sure that you are not preventing people or trying to harm people who are doing those recreational activities. You could be harming children, seniors, and everyone in between. Students. Imagine. All because of something that you feel is yours and yours alone, when you know that eventually, in time, you will pass that property on to another person who will take care of it after you. Our land is something that we should take care of greatly. Monitor it. Make sure that there is no damage to your land. And I don't condone anyone who would walk in and make an impact. But personally, if I'm moving through the woods, as I have many times before, I make an effort to make very little impact, if any, that you would ever know I was there. I run into this a lot when we're talking with our hunting groups, especially with our ethics class, with our bow hunters. They have a very low impact sport. The art of hunting with a bow is a very traditional art, and it is a true art form. It's something to master. To be able to be in the woods close enough to arrow a deer, or to get close enough to an animal where you can see its breath or hear it eating, is something that doesn't come without a great deal of practice. And these people are very proficient at being unseen, unheard, and very courteous. They do not want to do damage, and I can say for the last several years, all the classes that I have instructed on have been fantastic. We're all conservationists at heart. We want to be very careful, and we respect the lands that everyone owns. And I had to go through an adjustment period because the tales that I was told about land ownership and posting signage and all this different stuff from even my own family didn't actually follow through with the law, which I had to learn all over again when I started working here in Nova Scotia. Now, things changed, and I'll remind you of the legal requirements here, your personal situation. There's a lot of different varieties of things. I wanted to make you aware of this as a landowner and a recreational activity participant. Everything that you do as behavior after this can be identified. If you're littering, if you throw trash on the ground, you leave it there, that's a fine. You're not protected by this clause. If you damage the ground, you damage the trees, that's a fine. That's a charge. You could be charged for that. It's not a charge that would bring compensation to a landowner, because that's a civil process afterwards, which the landowner would have to pursue on their own and seek legal advice about. However, the aspect of signage and all of the different aspects that come in with trespassing as a landowner as defined in other provinces, they don't apply here with woodlands. And I would encourage everyone to do their own research, jump into this act, read it thoroughly. Civil trespassing is a huge issue that is quite often dealt with by police here when it doesn't need to be. With a little bit of understanding and general conversation, you're going to do fine. But you have to know where you stand when you bought your land or when you inherited your land. No matter how long you've been here or how short, this is the way the law has been for many, many years. I hope this is helping you guys out. Remember, police officers are people too. They don't always necessarily know all the laws. It takes many years in order to get up on all these things, and a lot of conversation with lawyers, crown prosecutors, and a lot of tongue lashing in court in order to hear what judges have to say about this stuff. You guys are the future. I want you to take care of each other. Remember, that person that is on your land is a human being. They are there doing something. Ask more questions. See what they're doing. They do have to identify themselves to you. They do have to provide identification. They have to tell you who they are. They can't just arbitrarily say no. They do have to. And if not, the police will identify them if they're able to be there for it. Okay? I know that this post is going to ruffle some feathers. It's something where police officers and law enforcement may take it as my opinion. That's why I decided to show you guys and read exactly from the act itself. You guys can apply it to your own situation, understand it, read it 2 or 3 times, take a deep breath, and make sure that you are fully aware of what is protecting each person on each side. They're just trying to do something. You're trying to protect your land, which is fair on both sides. It's really important that you seek mediation if you can't come to an agreement, or talk it out. These people can be your best friends on both sides, and each of you usually have an issue that you're trying to resolve. One of you might be trying to fill your freezer with fish or food. You might be trying to get an education so that you can go out to school. You may simply be trying to camp in the woods, take in nature. And there's no better place to do it in the woods in Nova Scotia. All right, guys, I'm going to leave you with a quick story, something that actually did happen to me. I am a licensed hunting and fishing guide here in the province, as well as being a retired police officer. I was guiding my brother-in-law, who has never, ever hunted a larger game species, which would be deer. And my family is from a very specific area. I was hunting on a neighbor's property, and we actually weren't hunting. We were just scouting to see where the herds were. Historically, there's been 4 or 5 deer herds in the area, and we have permission to hunt on all these different sections of land from all the different neighbors because we've known each other for a long time. I was walking down the very long laneway, it's about 1 kilometer long, trying to get into one of the fields. And I was walking with my brother-in-law. He was at the time the only one carrying a gun. We were both dressed in hunter's orange, but I was guiding him, showing where to go. And down this very long laneway comes this white truck, and this fella pulls up, and he's very gruff, and he's like, "What are you doing here?" I said, "We're going down to have a look, see where the deer are." "You can't be here. Get the beep out of here. You're not allowed to hunt here." I said, "Well, that's news to me." I said, "I know the owner." I said, and I named him. I said, and we were told that we had never-ending permission to hunt down here. Well, I don't care. Get out of here. Just so happens the gentleman had a truck full of apples. So, like-minded, he's protecting his territory. So I didn't argue with him. I just had a confrontation. I was a police officer at the time, and I was guiding my brother-in-law, so there's lots of opportunity for me to be emotional and get carried up there. But I turned around, and we walked back up the laneway, the long laneway, and we walked over back to my family land. As I'm walking up the laneway, another vehicle comes up the driveway. It just turns out it was his grandmother. I say, hey, how are you? Oh, hi, how are you? I said, well, I just had an interesting interaction. Your grandson just stopped me on the side of the road, and here's what he said. And I repeated the conversation. She says, well, that's not so neighborly. I said, no, it's okay. I understand. We're just going to go back home. She said, all right, well, I'll talk to him. Anyway, I didn't ask anything of her. I'm not going to ask her to take up my cause, no matter what, because she is the neighbor, and she doesn't deserve to have any headaches. She gave me permission. It never revoked it. No problem. I walked maybe another 500 yards. Didn't even make it into our family land. That truck roars into my driveway and ahead of me. And he meets me walking. And he comes out, I am so sorry for what happened. You can hunt down there anytime you want. This is where my stand is. This is where you can go. And I said, you know what? I said, you don't have to do that. I said, I appreciate it. I actually wasn't hunting. I was looking to see where the herds were so we could time to see where they're going to be, because we only have a few days for this, my brother-in-law, in order to get a deer. It was an excellent interaction, and that is the ideal way of dealing with something. I had permission, by the way. I could have dug my heels in. I didn't. All I had to do was talk to the authority that gave us the permission in the first place, and it was resolved within minutes. Guys, you should seek permission first, but just know if you get caught in the open, or if you can't find out who it is, you're still protected under the Protection of Property Act. Take care of yourselves. Get out there. Enjoy the outdoors. Get out of the house. And if you like the content, click subscribe, hit the bell for future content, and leave a comment. If you want to have some questions that you think I can help you with, I'm not going to help you with any specific situations. I'm sorry. It's just not going to happen. But in general, if you have any questions or comments that would help me out, direct me, correct me. That's what this conversation is all about. Hopefully, this has been some use of some use for you. I'm not perfect. No one is. Have a good day. See ya.